I never thought a routine job, just another client, just another address on my list, would be the beginning of something that would stay with me long after the tools were packed away. But that's what happened. Showed up to install a basic home security system and left with something far more fragile and far more lasting. Because sometimes safety isn't about cameras or alarms. It's about someone who listens, someone who stays. And when she whispered, "I feel safe with you here," I realized it wasn't just about her house being protected. It was her heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was early spring when I first pulled up to her house. The rain from the night before had left a shimmer on the sidewalks. The sky was caught in that in-between gray, not quite gloomy, but not welcoming either. I remember thinking the place looked a little too clean, perfect rows of hedges. A porch light that was still on even though it was mid-morning, wind chimes that hadn't made a sound. The house itself was neat, well-maintained, but there was something still about it, like the life inside it had gone quiet a long time ago. I double-checked the address, then grabbed my clipboard and stepped out of the van. Her name was Elise. I'd only spoken with her once over the phone, and even then she sounded like someone who measured every word. Polite, a little distant, maybe even guarded. She'd asked for the full home security package: door sensors, motion detectors, cameras. Nothing too fancy, but comprehensive. I assumed she'd had a break-in or maybe a scare. It's usually one or the other. But when she opened the door that morning, it wasn't fear I saw in her eyes. It was something closer to exhaustion. The kind of tired that doesn't come from a single sleepless night, but from years of carrying something heavy without anyone to help. She was in her late 40s, I'd guess. Dark hair pulled back in a clip, faint lines around her mouth and eyes that didn't look like they'd come from smiling. She was wearing a faded hoodie and jeans, barefoot, even though the floors inside looked like they'd be cold. She didn't say much, just held the door open wider and gestured for me to come in. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "You can set up in here," she said, pointing toward the small control panel area near the front door. Her hands were tucked into the sleeves of her sweatshirt, like she was trying to disappear inside the fabric. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No music, no TV, not even the faint buzz of a kitchen appliance or a ticking clock. I could hear my own breathing as I unpacked the tools and started surveying where to place the panel and sensors. Most homeowners usually hover. They ask questions or try to make awkward small talk. But Elise just drifted in and out of the room like a shadow, only appearing when she had to sign something or when I asked where the next sensor should go. And even then, it was always just a nod or a single-word answer. It wasn't rude. Felt more like she was somewhere else entirely. By mid-morning, I'd installed most of the core components. The cameras would be last. I usually save those because they involve the most precision and customer input: where to aim,
what to capture,
blind spots. When I asked her where she wanted the exterior cameras mounted, she paused for a long time before answering. "I don't. No, just make sure I can see everything." The way she said it didn't feel paranoid, it felt personal. Like the threat wasn't outside her house, but somewhere else, somewhere closer. As I worked on the front porch, climbing the ladder to mount the first camera above the door, I saw her standing by the window, arms crossed, watching the street. She didn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed on something beyond the trees. I don't think she realized I could see her from that angle, or maybe she didn't care. She looked like she was waiting for something, or someone. I finished the exterior. Installs before lunch. She hadn't offered anything: no coffee, no water, not even a thank you yet. But I didn't mind. Sometimes people needed space. Maybe she was just shy. Maybe she had a bad day. I'd seen it all in this job: newly divorced homeowners trying to pick up the pieces, elderly couples clinging to routines, young families worried about their kids. Every home had its own energy, and Elise's. It was like walking into a memory. Just before I packed up for the day, she finally spoke more than 2 words. I was testing the panel, making sure the keypad was responding properly. She stepped into the hallway and asked, almost hesitantly, how long the job would take. I told her 2, maybe 3 days, depending on any wiring complications. Her eyes flicked toward the front door like she was calculating something, then back to me. Okay, she said, then nodded and walked away. No, see you tomorrow. No small talk. Just okay, I left the house with a strange feeling I couldn't shake. Something about Elise didn't add up, not in a criminal or suspicious way, but in a human way. There was something hollow in the air around her, like the house was full of things unsaid. I drove home that night with the windows cracked and the radio off, thinking more about her silence than anything else, and I found myself wanting to go back the next day. Not for the paycheck, not for the job, but because something told me this wasn't just about installing a security system. It was about being seen, and maybe, just maybe, being needed. The second morning arrived with a stillness that matched the way she'd left things the day before. I pulled into her driveway just after 9 a.m., the same time as before, and noticed nothing had changed. Same porch light glowing faintly in daylight, same drawn curtains in every window, same sense of pause hanging in the air like the house was holding its breath. I grabbed my gear from the van and stood for a moment in front of her door, uncertain whether to knock or just wait. Before I could make the decision, the door creaked open. She stood there again, same hoodie, same quiet eyes, like I hadn't left the day before. There was no greeting, only a small tilt of her head, as if to say, "You can come in." I nodded silently, and stepped inside, trying to ignore the way my chest tightened with the odd tension of this place. The air inside was just as still, though I noticed a small detail had shifted. A ceramic mug sat on the end table by the couch, half full of coffee and steaming faintly, suggesting she'd been awake for a while. That was something, at least. I headed straight for the basement where I needed to run a couple of connection checks for the sensors I'd installed upstairs. The wiring was older than I expected, and I made a mental note to recommend an update once the job was done. The basement was surprisingly clean, with neatly labeled boxes and plastic bins stacked along the walls. But it was cold and dim, and I couldn't shake the feeling that no one had spent any meaningful time down there in years. By the time I came back upstairs, Elise had moved into the kitchen. She was standing by the sink with her back to me, her arms braced on the counter like she was holding herself upright. I walked quietly, not wanting to startle her, and when she turned around, there was the faintest flicker of surprise in her expression. I told her everything was checking out so far, and that I'd begin mounting the interior cameras next. She nodded again, and for a brief second, it looked like she was about to say something else. But instead, she just moved aside, giving me access to the hallway. I started with the hallway camera, which was meant to capture the entry points in high-traffic areas. The layout of her house was simple: a front hall that led into a small living area, a short hallway to the left that branched off to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, and a modest kitchen tucked off to the right. Too quiet in. I found myself hyper-aware of every small sound I made, every screw driven in, every ladder foot adjusted, every beep from the device as I tested it. Elise watched from the end of the hallway for a while, arms crossed again, leaning against the wall. Her presence didn't feel intrusive. If anything, it felt like she didn't want to be alone in a room, even if she wasn't speaking. Eventually, I asked if she had any specific areas she wanted the cameras pointed toward. She thought for a second, and then quietly said, "Just the doors, all of them." I assured her that would be covered. As I worked, I caught glimpses of the artwork hanging on her walls, mostly landscapes, muted in color, almost abstract. Nothing cheerful, nothing personal, no photographs, no keepsakes, no signs of anyone else having lived there. It was a house that felt like it had erased its own story. Around noon, I finished the second camera and headed out to the van to grab a replacement lens. When I came back, there was something different in the air, a faint aroma of something warming. On the stove, and a mug placed on the small kitchen island. This one was for me. Coffee black, no sugar. I didn't hear her place it there, and she didn't say anything when I picked it up, just gave the smallest nod and returned to staring out the kitchen window. But it was a gesture, and in a space where silence filled every crack, gestures meant everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Back to the story. I thanked her and took a sip. It was strong and slightly bitter, but good. The kind of coffee someone makes for themselves, not guests. We stood there for a moment, her by the window, me by the counter, not saying anything, and yet the quiet felt less sharp, less distant. After a minute, she asked me how long I'd been doing this kind of work. Her voice was soft, but steady. I told her it had been about 6 years, enough time to see all kinds of people, kinds of houses, and all kinds of reasons people felt they needed more protection. She looked at me then, really looked, and said, "Sometimes it's not about what's outside, is it?" I didn't know how to respond to that, not right away. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but I also felt like I wasn't supposed to. Like it wasn't a question I'd earned the right to ask. So instead I just said, "No, it's not." She nodded once and walked back into the living room. The rest of the day passed quietly. I installed the final interior camera near the back door and began testing the motion detectors. Each time I needed access to a room, she'd appear a few steps ahead, silently opening doors before I got there. It was like she knew the flow of the work instinctively, like she'd rehearsed it in her mind. I couldn't shake the thought that she'd been planning this for longer than she let on by the time I started wrapping up for the day. The sky had shifted again, late afternoon light, casting long shadows through the blinds. She walked me to the door this time. Not all the way, just close enough that I could see her silhouette behind me as I packed up my bag. I told her I'd be back in the morning for the final calibration and walkthrough. She nodded, then hesitated. Her hand gripped the edge of the doorframe as she stood there. "Thank you," she said, barely audible. I turned and told her I was just doing my job, but as I walked down the steps and back to my van, I knew it wasn't just a job anymore. Not because I was developing feelings, not yet anyway, but because the lines had shifted. This wasn't just a woman hiring me to install security. This was someone asking, in her own quiet way, not to be alone in the silence anymore. And I found myself thinking about her again on the way home, more than I should have. Something was drawing me back. Not just the house, not just the job. Her the third morning felt different even before I left the house. I'd barely had my first sip of coffee when I caught myself checking the time, wondering if it was too early to head over to Elise's. Something about the way she'd said thank you the night before had been looping in my mind, soft and unfinished, like there was more she wanted to say but couldn't. I kept thinking about the way she had gripped the doorframe, as if anchoring herself to the moment. As I drove through the slowly waking streets, I wondered if that house had ever felt like a home to her, or if it was just a place she stayed because she didn't know where else to go when I arrived.
Oh.
She was already standing on the porch. Not sitting, not opening the door when she heard the van pull up. She was there, waiting. She wasn't dressed any differently, still in a hoodie and jeans, but the shift was in her posture. She stood a little straighter. She nodded at me with something that could almost pass for warmth. Wasn't a smile, not quite, but it was. Something close. I returned the nod, grabbed my gear, and made my way up the steps. She stepped aside and let me in, this time without needing a glance or a gesture. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It didn't press in as tightly. As it had before, there was space in it now, room for breath. Today was supposed to be a simple wrap, pep testing all the sensors, syncing the mobile app to her phone, walking her through the basic functions. I'd done it 100 times. But I could already feel that this wouldn't be just another final walkthrough. Elise moved differently through the house now. She still didn't speak much, but she didn't disappear either. She hovered nearby, quiet but present, watching the way I moved, the way I checked each panel, adjusted each camera, ran the diagnostics. Every so often, our eyes would meet, and she wouldn't look away immediately like she had before. There was a question forming in the air between us, one neither of us had the language to ask yet. As I adjusted the camera in the hallway one last time, she stood at the end of it again, hands clasped in front of her. The same spot as the day before, but this time she didn't lean against the wall. She watched me work, and when I finished, I turned and gave her a small thumbs up, indicating it was good to go. Her shoulders dropped just slightly as if releasing a tension she hadn't even known she was holding. She nodded again and turned toward the kitchen. I followed, not because I needed to, but because something told me it was the right thing to do. There was another mug on the counter. This one wasn't black. It had a pale blue pattern around the rim, faded and chipped in one spot. She gestured toward it, then back at the stove where I saw a kettle just starting to steam. Without a word, she poured 2 cups. No sugar, no cream, just plain dark coffee. I took the mug and followed her to the small breakfast nook tucked beside the window. We sat. No table between us, just the worn cushion of the window seat and the soft creak of old wood as we settled in. The light outside was soft, filtered through a layer of clouds that had gathered while I worked. Like the whole world had slowed down to let this moment happen. We sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee, watching the wind tug at the trees outside. Then she spoke quietly, almost like she was testing the sound of her own voice. "I used to live with someone," she said. I didn't respond, just waited. She didn't look at me when she continued. He was ... not good. Not in the way people mean. When they say that to excuse someone, it made things feel like walking on glass. Every word had to be the right one, or it would all break. Letting her talk, letting the silence between her sentences stay open. She wasn't telling me everything, not even close. But what she gave me was enough to understand the rest. That's why I needed the system, she said. Not because I'm scared of burglars, but because I needed to feel like I had control again. Like I could sleep without listening for footsteps that weren't mine. Her voice cracked just slightly on that last sentence, and she turned her face toward the window. I wanted to say anything, but nothing felt right. So I just stayed there, letting the weight of her words settle between us. Eventually, she set her mug down and stood. I followed her back to the living room where the main control panel was mounted on the wall. I showed her the basic functions, how to arm and disarm the system, how to review footage, how to adjust the sensitivity of the motion detectors. She listened, asked a few technical questions, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of confidence in her expression. It was subtle, but it was there. Like she was remembering something she'd forgotten, part of herself that had gone quiet when the walkthrough was done. I gathered my tools and told her that was it. Job complete. The usual moment of polite distance should have come next. Maybe a handshake, the door gently closing behind me. But she didn't move toward the door. She stood in the middle of the room, looking at me with something new in her eyes. Not vulnerability, not fear. Something steadier, stronger. I slung my tool bag over my shoulder and told her she could call the office if she had any issues. But she didn't even blink. Instead, she stepped closer. Just a half step. Not enough to invade space, but enough. To cross a line, I waited, unsure of what was coming next. And then, in a voice barely louder than the wind brushing against the windows, she said it. "I feel safe with you here." My breath caught, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way she said them. It wasn't flirty. It wasn't even emotional in the traditional sense. It was matter of fact, truth spoken aloud after. Being quietly realized, I stood there for a moment, not sure how to respond, not wanting to ruin whatever had just passed between us. So I just nodded, slowly, and said I was glad. And I meant it. She walked me to the door this time, close enough that our arms nearly brushed. When I stepped outside, she stayed in the doorway, watching. I turned at the bottom of the steps and gave her a wave. She raised her hand in return, then lowered it quickly like she wasn't used to the gesture. The porch light was still on. Even in the gray light of afternoon, driving away felt heavier than I expected. I told myself it was just a job, just another house, just another client. But I knew better. Something had started here. Not necessarily a romance. Not something you could put a name to, but a shift, a change. A door opening, even if only a crack, and I didn't know it then. But that one sentence, those 6 words would pull me back again, whether there was work left to do or not. I didn't. Have another job scheduled the next day. I could have easily spent it catching up on errands, organizing the van, or doing something productive. But instead, I found myself pacing around my apartment, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm, staring at my phone like I was waiting for a message that would never come. Elise hadn't asked me to return. There were no follow-up tasks, no lingering issues with the system I'd installed. The job was done. But the weight of her voice, the way she had said those 6 quiet words, "I feel safe with you here," had embedded themselves in my chest like a hook. I didn't know how to remove. It wasn't about romance or curiosity. It was about something deeper, quieter, something I couldn't explain. So by mid-morning, I was back in my van. Driving toward her house without a real reason to go, I told myself I'd left a tool behind, that I needed to double-check the wiring on the control panel. Anything to justify why I was showing up unannounced. But when I pulled into her driveway, I realized I didn't need an excuse. The porch light was still on, even in the full brightness of day. That small detail told me everything I needed to know. She was still inside, still watching, still waiting. In her own way, I stepped out of the van, toolbox in hand, and walked up the steps. Before I could knock, the door opened. She was already there. This time, she didn't just gesture silently for me to come in. She opened the door wide, stepped back and said, "Good morning." It's just 2 words, but they felt heavier than a full conversation. Her voice was still soft, but there was something lighter behind it. Like the weight she had carried yesterday had shifted just enough to let some light in. I returned the greeting, told her I wanted to run one final diagnostic on the system, make sure everything was working properly. She didn't question it. She simply nodded and stepped aside. Inside, the house felt warmer. Not physically, it was still the same cool air, the same scent of lavender, cleaner, and faint coffee, but emotionally, the silence no longer felt sharp or oppressive. It had softened into something shared. As I approached the control panel, I could hear the quiet hum of the kettle in the kitchen. A moment later, she appeared beside me, holding 2 mugs. One black, one with the pale blue rim. I took the blue one, not because it was familiar, but because it felt like an invitation. We sat at the same breakfast nook as before, sipping our coffee in silence. This time, though she was the first to speak, "I used to think security meant locks and bolts and alarms," she said, her gaze fixed outside the window. "But it's not. It's people. It's knowing someone would care enough to notice if you were gone." Her words weren't dramatic or performative. They were just ... true. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak just yet. The truth was, I knew exactly what she meant. I'd lived alone for years, spent holidays in silence, gone weeks without anyone asking where I'd been. It's easy to disappear when no one's looking for you. She turned to me then, and for the first time, I saw the full depth of what she'd been holding back. There was pain in her eyes, yes, but there was also courage. The kind it takes to keep going when every part of you wants to stop. I asked her if she ever felt truly safe before. She paused, then said maybe once, when she was a child. Before everything became complicated, before trust became something she had to earn over and over again. She looked away quickly after that, as if she'd said too much. I didn't want to push her. So I shifted the conversation, told her about the small towns I'd worked in, the different homes I'd been invited into, the people I'd met along the way. She listened, really listened, her eyes following every word like she was memorizing them, and somewhere in the middle of one of my stories, she laughed. It was soft and sudden, catching both of us off guard. It wasn't a big laugh, just a quiet breath of air that escaped before she could stop it. But it changed everything. After coffee, we moved to the living room. She asked if I could show her how to adjust the night settings on the app. I sat beside her on the couch, close enough to see the subtle freckles across her cheeks, the way. Her hands trembled just slightly when she handed me the phone. I walked her through the settings, showing her how to schedule the system to arm itself each night automatically. She nodded, following along, and when I finished, she said thank you again. This time, though, it wasn't just polite, it was layered. With meaning, with gratitude, with something unspoken that hung between us like a breath waiting to be exhaled. The afternoon passed slowly, gently. We talked more than we had before, about small things, books she used to read, the garden she never had time to plant, the music she played when the house felt too quiet. She asked about me too, not in a superficial way, but like she really wanted to know who I was beyond the man with the tool belt. And I found myself telling her things I hadn't said out loud in years. About my father who taught me how to fix things, about the apartment that never quite felt like home, about the silence I'd learned to live with until now. At some point, we ended up in the backyard. The grass was a little overgrown, the flower beds empty, but there was potential there. She stood in the middle of the yard, looking up at the trees, the wind brushing her hair across her face. She looked peaceful. I asked her if she ever thought about moving. She shook her head. No, this house has seen too much of me. I can't. Leave it behind, even if it never really felt like mine. I understood that. Some places become part of you even if they hurt. The sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. She turned to me then and said, I don't usually let people stay this long. I told her I didn't usually stay unless I was being paid. We both smiled at that, the first shared smile that felt real, unguarded. It wasn't flirtation, it wasn't tension. It was something better, mutual understanding. I told her I should head out soon, that I'd taken up enough of her day. She didn't argue, didn't ask me to stay, but she didn't walk me to the door this time either. She stood on the porch as I packed up, just like before, watching, waiting. When I turned to wave, she raised her hand again, this time a little higher, a little more certain. And for the first time, the porch light was off. Driving home, I thought about how strange it was to find something meaningful in the quiet, in the pauses between words. I'd spent so many years believing connection had to be loud, full of laughter and motion. But Elise had shown me something different. That safety could live in silence, in shared coffee, in the way someone simply chooses to stay. And though I hadn't said it out loud, I knew I'd be back. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not the day after. But something had begun here, something too quiet to name and too strong to ignore. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. I went back to my regular schedule, wiring jobs, alarm installations, the usual grind, but nothing felt the same. Every house I stepped into felt too loud or too sterile. The people I worked with chatted about things that barely skimmed the surface of anything real. I laughed in the right places, nodded when expected, but part of my mind was always somewhere else. With her, with Elise, it wasn't that I was infatuated, not in the way you get with someone you've just met and feel drawn to instantly. This was something slower, steadier. Like when you finally sit down after a long day and realize just how tired you've been. That house, her quiet presence, had stirred something in me that I hadn't known I was missing. I didn't plan to go back. I told myself that chapter was closed. But one afternoon, in the middle of replacing a faulty door sensor in a suburban bungalow, my phone buzzed. It was a text, short and unadorned. Hi, it's Elise. The porch camera seems to be acting strange. Do you mind stopping by? There was no urgency in the message, no pleading, just a simple request. Still, I found myself packing up faster than usual, rescheduling my next appointment, and heading across town before I could talk myself out of it. Her house looked exactly the same when I arrived. Neatly trimmed hedges, a few scattered leaves. On the steps, the faint glint of the porch light, though it was still early in the day. But this time, something small had changed. The front door was already open, just a crack, like she'd been waiting. When I stepped onto the porch, she pushed it open fully and gave a small nod, her version of a welcome. She wore a different hoodie this time, navy blue instead of gray, and her hair was tucked loosely behind her ears. There was something softer about her posture, like the edges of her usual guardedness had been worn down just slightly. I told her I'd take a look at the porch camera, and she led me out through the front room in silence. It didn't take long to diagnose the issue, just a loose wire that needed a quick refit. But even after I tightened the connection and reset the feed, I lingered a little longer than necessary, adjusting the angle and testing it from the app. She watched me from the threshold, hands in her sleeves, eyes scanning my every move like she was memorizing the steps. When I was done, I told her everything was back online. She nodded, then hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "Do you have time for coffee?" she asked. It was the first time she'd invited me for anything explicitly. No gestures, no silent offers, just a question, direct and clear. I said yes before my brain even had time to process the implications. She stepped aside, and we moved into the kitchen together. The kettle was already hot, and as she poured water into the mugs, I noticed something new, a small vase of fresh flowers on the counter. Nothing extravagant, just a few stems of lavender and something wild from the garden, but it shifted the feel of the space. A detail added with intention. A sign of life being let back in. We took our mugs to the window seat again, the same one where we'd shared silence before. This time, though, the silence didn't linger. She started talking as soon as we sat, her voice steady but quiet. She told me about her dog, a mutt named Jasper, who had passed away the year before. He used to sit by that window, watching the street like a sentry, always alert. She smiled faintly when she mentioned how he used to bark at birds and delivery trucks, as if trying to protect her from the world outside. "The house has been too quiet since he left," she said. "Too still." I listened, letting her take the lead. The way she spoke about Jasper made it clear he hadn't just been a pet. He'd been her companion, her guardian, her link to a time when she didn't feel quite so alone. I told her about my own childhood dog, how I'd cried for days when we lost him, how I still sometimes thought I heard his collar jingling when the house got quiet. That made her laugh softly, and it felt like a gift. Something rare and delicate she was offering without realizing it. She asked if I liked what I did, fixing homes, installing security systems. It wasn't a question people asked me often, and I had to think about it for a moment. I told her I did. Not because it was exciting or glamorous, but because there was something deeply human about it. People didn't just call me to install wires or cameras, they called me when they were afraid, when they felt exposed, when they needed to feel safe again. And being able to give them that, even in a small way, mattered. She looked at me then. Really looked, and there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, not sadness, something warmer, trust, maybe even hope. I wondered how long it had been since she'd looked at someone that way. The hours slipped by without either of us noticing. When the sun dipped low and the light in the kitchen turned golden, she stood and said she had something to show me. I followed her down the hallway to a room I hadn't been in before. It was small, maybe once a guest bedroom or an office, but now it was filled with canvases, paintings, half-finished sketches, jars of brushes lined neatly on a shelf. "I used to paint," she said, running a finger along the edge of one canvas. "Haven't in a long time." The room was quiet, but alive. Color and texture and intention spilled across the walls, the floors, was the most expressive part. "Of the house by far, why did you stop?" I asked. She hesitated, then shrugged. "When you don't feel safe, creativity feels like a luxury. It's hard to make art when you're just trying to survive." I didn't have a response to that. Not one that would do it justice. So I just stepped closer and looked at the nearest painting, a swirl of muted blues and grays. The suggestion of a storm clearing on the horizon was beautiful and sad and hopeful all at once. "Like her, you should start again," I said quietly. "Not for anyone else, just for you." She didn't answer, but her fingers lingered on one of the brushes, like she was remembering how it used to feel in her hand. Eventually, I had to leave. The sky had gone dark, and I had no excuse to stay longer. At the door, she thanked me again. This time, she didn't look away. She held my gaze steady and open and said, "It's easier to breathe when you're here." That line echoed in me all the way home. Whatever this was, friendship, healing, something Marit was building quietly, like layers of paint on a canvas, soft and deliberate. And though neither of us had said it out loud, we both knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. The days that followed felt unusually quiet, even with the usual hum of work and daily routines filling the spaces in between. But the silence wasn't the same kind of emptiness I'd felt before I met Elise. It was quieter, yes, but not hollow. It was reflective, like something had been stirred inside me and hadn't quite settled yet. Each time I reached for my phone, I found myself wondering whether she was painting again, Whether the coffee mug with the chipped blue rim was back in her hands, whether her porch light was still on, even in the middle of the afternoon. There was no message from her, no subtle hint to come by, but I didn't need one. I could feel her presence now, tucked away in a corner of my thoughts, where something calm and steady had begun to grow. On a Saturday morning, as the city stretched awake under gray clouds, I decided to stop by without a reason. I told myself I'd make it. Casual, just a check-in, a courtesy call. Maybe I'd even bring something with me to make it look less like I was there just because I missed her presence. At the corner cafe near my place, I picked up 2 fresh pastries and a thermos of coffee, balancing them carefully as I walked up the steps to her house. The porch light was on again. That small detail was oddly comforting now, like a sign she was still inside, still carrying on with her quiet, measured life. When I knocked, she answered faster than I expected, as if she'd been close to the door the entire time. She looked surprised to see me, her eyes widening briefly before softening. She didn't ask why I was there. She just stepped aside and let me in, the door swinging open with a smoothness that felt like familiarity. I held up the pastries and the thermos, offering a small grin. She blinked once, then let out a faint breath of laughter barely audible, but real. We settled into the kitchen, where I poured the coffee into the mismatched mugs she pulled from the cabinet. I noticed she handed me the chipped one again. This time, it didn't feel like a default. It felt like a choice. We sat in the same window nook as always, the rhythm of our morning together falling into place without a word exchanged. The pastry was warm and flaky, and I caught her smiling into her napkin after the first bite. It wasn't forced. It was one of those small, unguarded moments that made everything else blur into the background as we ate. She started talking about the painting room again. She hadn't picked up the brush yet, she said, but she'd opened the windows in there for the first time in months. Let the light in, let the air change. Sometimes, she added, just opening the door was enough for the day. I told her that counted. Progress wasn't always about motion sometimes. It was about stillness, about choosing not to retreat anymore. She looked at me like she understood exactly what I meant. Like she knew I wasn't just talking about her. She stood up a little later and disappeared down the hall, her drawers opening, soft footsteps, then nothing for a long moment. When she returned, she was holding a canvas. It was smaller than the ones I'd seen before, and the colors were muted, like a storm cloud had been frozen mid-breath. She didn't say anything, just placed it on the table between us and let me look. The brushstrokes were delicate, almost hesitant, but the emotion behind them was undeniable. There was grief in the piece, yes, but also something tender beneath it, a reaching, trying. You painted this? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She nodded slowly. Last night, she said, it's not finished. It doesn't have to be, I replied. She looked at me then, and her eyes held something new, something like pride, though not quite. More like relief. It's like being seen and knowing it was safe to stay visible. Later, we took our coffee out to the backyard. The grass was slightly damp from the night's rain, but the sky had begun to clear, light filtering through like a slow promise. She showed me where she used to plant tulips along the edge of the fence. The soil was dry now, the outlines of old garden beds barely visible, but her voice carried the memory as vividly as if the flowers were still blooming. I told her it was never too late to start again. She glanced down at her hands, then at the dull patch of earth, and said maybe in the spring. We ended up sitting on the steps, not talking much, just letting the day stretch out around us. I told her about a place I used to go to as a kid, an old fishing dock on the edge of a lake where I'd sit with my grandfather. We never caught much, but it wasn't about that. It was about the quiet. It's about learning to sit in silence without needing to fill it. Elise listened intently, the way she always did, and when I was finished, she said she'd like to see it someday. It was the kind of thing people said lightly in passing, but when she said it, I knew she meant it, and I realized in that moment that I wanted her to see it too. The wind picked up slightly, and she tucked her hair behind her ears, shivering despite the sweater. I offered to grab the spare blanket I'd seen folded on the couch the last time. I was over, but she surprised me by leaning slightly toward me instead. Just enough for our shoulders to brush. It was barely anything, Just a whisper of contact, but it sent something steady and warm through me, grounding and unmistakably real. She didn't pull away. As the light faded, I knew I should go, but I didn't want to. I also knew staying too long might break whatever fragile understanding we'd built. So I stood, brushing the dirt from my jeans, and told her I'd come by next week to check on the system again, just in case. She didn't protest. She only nodded, then said, "Thank you for today." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. I nodded back, not trusting myself to say much more. At the door, she paused before opening it. And then she did something she hadn't done before. She reached out and gently touched my arm. "Just for a moment. You make the silence feel different," she said. "Less heavy." I left with those words wrapped around me like armor, and as I drove away, I realized something had shifted, not just in her, but in me. We were still learning each other's rhythms, still feeling our way through the soft edges of something undefined. But it was there now, real, tangible. Something had begun, and neither of us was running from it anymore. The week drifted by in slow increments, each day, punctuated by 1,000 little moments that somehow all pointed back to Elise. I'd be installing motion sensors in someone's hallway and catch myself wondering if she ever opened that painting room again. I'd be driving down some quiet suburban street and think about the chipped rim of her mug, the soft lilt in her voice when she talked about the past, the gentle way she said my name, like it wasn't just another job to her. It was strange how quickly someone could inhabit your thoughts, not as a distraction, but like a melody that lingered long after the song ended. I didn't text her. She didn't reach out either. And yet the space between us felt less like absence and more like anticipation. By the time I returned the following Saturday, the rhythm of visiting her house had become almost second nature. Her porch light was off this time, but the door creaked open before I could knock. She was wearing a loose olive green sweater and jeans, barefoot on the wooden floor. There was a softness in her face I hadn't seen before, like the edges had. Blurred a little, like she wasn't holding herself together quite as tightly. She gave me a look something between a smile and a sigh and stepped aside without a word. I walked in like I belonged, like I'd been doing this for years. This time she had music playing, just faintly, the kind of slow instrumental piano that filled the room without demanding attention. It surprised me. The last few visits had been so wrapped in quiet, the sound felt almost out of place. But as I followed her to the kitchen, I realized it fit. It was a new layer, a sign that something in her had begun to thaw. On the table, 2 plates were already set, each with a sandwich and a small bowl of soup. Nothing elaborate, but it made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. It was the first time she'd prepared anything for me without prompting. No gestures, no questions, just food waiting like it was the most natural thing in the world. We sat down and ate slowly, the conversation weaving in and out of comfortable silences. She told me about a book she'd started reading again, something from years ago that had always made her feel safe. I told her about a little diner I used to visit on late nights after work, how the waitress there had memorized my order without ever asking for my name. We laughed about how strange it was to form habits with strangers, how sometimes they remembered the smallest things when the people closest to us didn't. Elise nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. She always did. After lunch, we walked through the house together. She pointed out things she wanted to change, an old light fixture that buzzed sometimes, a bathroom drawer that never closed quite right. I made mental notes, offered to fix them sometime soon. It wasn't about the tasks themselves. It was about the excuse to stay involved, to keep coming back. We ended up in the hallway outside the painting room. A door was open this time, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor inside. I paused, waiting for her to invite me in. But she just stepped through without hesitation and began rummaging through a drawer in the corner. When she turned around, she was holding a paintbrush in one hand and a small canvas in the other. She sat down on the stool by the window and began moving her hands slowly, like muscle memory was waking up after a long sleep. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching her breathe life into the blank space. Every stroke was deliberate, but unhurried. She wasn't painting for me, or for anyone. She was painting for herself, for the part of her that had gone quiet for too long. And in that moment, I realized something. I hadn't just walked into her life as a visitor. I'd walked into a chapter she wasn't sure she'd ever write again. Eventually, she set the brush down and looked over her shoulder at me. Her eyes were clear, but tired. Not the exhaustion of physical labor, but the kind that comes from emotional release. She gave a small shrug, as if apologizing for letting me see something so raw. I stepped into the room and crouched beside her, not to interrupt, but to be there with her. To let her know I saw her, really saw her, and didn't flinch. She reached for a rag to clean her hands, and I noticed a faint smear of blue paint on her cheek. Without thinking, I lifted my hand and brushed it away with my thumb. She didn't move, didn't pull back. Her breath caught slightly, but she didn't look away. For a long moment, we just stayed like that, close, still, completely present. Then softly she said, "It's strange how safety feels. I used to think it was just about locks and lights, but now it feels like something else." I didn't answer right away. I didn't have to, because I knew exactly what she meant. It wasn't about alarms or motion detectors. It was about presence, about knowing someone saw you and stayed, about silence that didn't feel empty. I nodded slowly, and she leaned her shoulder into mine just slightly, enough to let me know she wasn't afraid of contact anymore. We stayed in that room for a while, not saying much, just letting the afternoon wrap around us like a blanket. Eventually, the sun dipped lower, and shadows began to stretch across the floor. Elise stood and stretched, rubbing her neck, then asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. Her voice was casual, almost too casual, like she didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but it was a big deal. Quiet offering. I agreed, of course, and we spent the next hour preparing something simple together: roasted vegetables, pasta, a bottle of wine she'd been saving for no special reason. We moved around the kitchen like we'd done it a dozen times, falling into a rhythm that didn't need instruction. We ate in the living room this time, plates balanced on our laps, the music still playing softly in the background. At one point, she freely laughed at something I said about a terrible first date I once had where the girl brought her mother. The sound of her laughter filled the room in a way that made it feel new, lived in, alive. After we'd cleaned up, I lingered by the door. She didn't ask me to stay, and I didn't push it. Some things take time. But just as I reached for the handle, she placed her hand lightly on my arm again, like she had before. "Thank you," she said, "for not rushing this." I told her she didn't need to thank me, but she shook her head and said, "No, I do, because you made space for me." And I didn't even know I needed that. That night, as I drove home through the empty streets, something settled in me, a kind of quiet certainty I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about me. It was about what we were slowly building together. Something soft, something safe, something real. And deep down I knew we were only just beginning to understand what that meant. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Even though it was Sunday and my phone hadn't buzzed with any reminders or deadlines, the apartment was quiet, and for once, I didn't turn on the TV for background noise or reach for my phone to scroll through the world. Instead, I sat by the window and let the stillness stretch. The sunlight slanted in at an angle that made everything look softer, quieter, like the world itself was trying to take a breath. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to fill the silence. I just let it be. And in that space, Elise's face drifted into my thoughts. Her soft smile over dinner, the light in her eyes when she held that paintbrush, the way her voice trembled slightly when she admitted that safety now meant something different. Later in the day, I found myself reorganizing the back of my van. I told myself it was long overdue, that the mess of wires and tools and spare batteries needed to be handled. But as I stacked a few unused motion detectors neatly into a bin and polished the surface of my most used drill, I realized I was doing it with her in mind. Not to impress her, not even to prepare for another job, but because something in me wanted to show up in her life a little more whole, a little more steady. And it felt like if I took care of the tools I used to build things for others, maybe I could better build something for us, to whatever this was becoming. I didn't see Elise that day, and there was no message from her. But there didn't need to be. The quiet between us had begun to feel like part of the story, not an absence, but a pause, breath, something necessary before the next line. I went to sleep that night without any restlessness, only a gentle awareness that something in my life was shifting, not fast, not loud, but steady and true. By midweek, I got a text. "Do you have time to look at the back door sensor? It's blinking again." Dead short, simple. I smiled to myself as I read it. The message was a question, sure, but it was also an invitation. And this time, I didn't hesitate. I told her I'd be there by 5. When I arrived, the sun was just beginning to sink behind the trees, casting a soft orange hue across her front porch. The light was off again, but the door opened before I reached it. She stood there, barefoot once more, her hair pulled back in a loose braid that fell over one shoulder. This time, she didn't step aside and wait. She reached for my hand gently as I came up the steps and gave it a light squeeze, her eyes warm and unreadable. I followed her inside, not even trying to hide the way my chest tightened at the simple contact. We didn't talk about the sensor right away. Instead, she led me through the living room, where a stack of canvases had appeared near the fireplace. Some were new, I could tell. The colors were fresher, the brushstrokes bolder. And right on top, there was one that stood out from the rest, a portrait, half finished, of a woman looking out a window. I recognized her instantly. It was Elise, or at least a version of her, a little younger maybe, or just painted with more light than she usually allowed herself to show. But the expression on her face, vulnerable, thoughtful, aware, was unmistakable. "You've been busy," I said, and she nodded. "Something unlocked," she murmured. "Like a door. Didn't know was still closed." She looked at me then, and for a long time neither of us said anything. There wasn't a need. It was all there in the painting, in the silence, in the way her eyes didn't flinch away anymore. Eventually I walked over and crouched beside the canvas, just taking it in. The background was unfinished, just faint outlines and muted colors. But the figure in the foreground was vivid and full of life, like she was waiting for the rest of her world to catch up. "Will you finish it?" I asked. "Maybe," she said softly, "or maybe it's already finished." Later, we moved to the kitchen, where she handed me a cup of tea instead of coffee this time. The scent of chamomile filled the space, and we drank slowly, watching the sky darken outside. The back door sensor, as it turned out, wasn't broken, just a battery that needed replacing. But she didn't seem surprised when I told her, almost like she knew that wasn't really why I'd come. After tea, we ended up in the backyard. The air was cooler now, the night setting in with a quiet hush that made every sound feel closer. The wind in the trees, the faint chirp of crickets, the distant hum of a neighbor's TV all blended into a kind of gentle lullaby. Elise brought out a blanket, and we sat side by side on the steps, wrapped in its warmth, our shoulders touching. She leaned her head against mine and closed her eyes, and I didn't move. I didn't need to. Everything we needed to say was already present in the quiet between us. Then, out of nowhere, she whispered it. "I feel safe with you here." She didn't say it dramatically. There was no build-up, no emotional overture. It's just a simple truth, released into the night like a breath she'd been holding in for years. When she said it, something inside me settled, like a stone sinking to the bottom of a riverbed, where it was always meant to rest. I turned to her, but she didn't open her eyes. She didn't have to. I understood, because I felt the same. We stayed like that for a long time. No rush. No next step hanging in the air. It's just two people sitting under the stars, wrapped in something soft and rare and quietly powerful. It wasn't romance yet. Not in the way most people would describe it, but it was something else, something gentler, truer, a kind of intimacy that came not from touch or confession, but from presence, from showing up again and again with no mask and no agenda. When I left that night, I didn't feel like I was leaving her behind. I felt like I was carrying something with me, a piece of her trust, thread of connection that stretched between us, invisible but unbreakable. And as I drove home in the dark, the echo of her words followed me. I feel safe with you here. It wasn't just a compliment, wasn't just gratitude. It was a promise, one I intended to keep. The days after that night seemed to carry a different weight, one that wasn't heavy, but meaningful, like everything I did was connected somehow to something larger, something unfolding slowly just beneath the surface. Work felt the same on the outside, the same calls, the same wiring, the same creaky attics and musty basements. But my thoughts always drifted back to that moment on Elise's porch. Her voice whispering those words, not out of fragility, but from a place of honesty, kept echoing through me with the soft, steady rhythm of a heartbeat. I didn't tell anyone about her, not my coworkers, not my old friends who occasionally called to see if I was still living the bachelor life, not even the elderly couple I often did small odd jobs for who liked to ask if I was seeing someone. Nice. It wasn't secrecy. It was sacred. I wasn't ready to share what hadn't fully revealed itself yet. Elise didn't text again. But a few days later, when I found myself with a slower afternoon and my van already heading toward her side of town, I took the familiar turns without needing to convince myself. I didn't even bring tools this time. No sensor replacements. No screwdrivers in my back pocket. Just me. And the vague idea that maybe she'd be painting. Maybe she'd be out in the backyard again, and maybe we'd sit in the quiet the way we had before and not need to explain why. Her porch light was on this time, but the blinds were drawn. I knocked, half expecting no answer, but the door opened within seconds. Elise looked surprised, not unpleasantly, just caught off guard. Her hair was damp and tied up loosely, and she wore a faded t-shirt with paint smudges along the hem and sleeves. She smiled, the kind of smile that flickered before it held. "I didn't think you'd come by today," she said. I shrugged, lifting the small brown bag I held up to eye level. "I brought those lemon bars you said you missed." She blinked, then frilly laughed. "I haven't thought about those in years." She stepped aside. I walked in like it was the most natural thing in the world. We ate the lemon bars in the kitchen without plates, napkins tucked under our chins like two kids sneaking dessert before dinner. Crumbs got everywhere in it. One point she leaned over and brushed a few off my shirt, her fingers lingering for just a second too long. It wasn't romantic, not exactly. But there was something about the way her touch stayed a moment longer than necessary that made my breath catch, that made my heart beat just a little louder than usual. Afterward, she asked if I wanted to see something. Without waiting for my answer, she led me down the hall to the room at the end of the house, not the painting room this time, but one I hadn't been inside before. It was small, square, and clearly unused. Boxes lined the walls. A thin layer of dust had settled across everything, like time had tried to bury whatever memories lingered there. She walked slowly to the center and turned to face me, eyes unreadable. "I've been thinking about making this into something new," she said. "A space to work, or maybe to just sit and think. I don't know yet." I looked around, letting the silence breathe between us. The walls were bare, but there was potential in the room. I could see it already. A soft chair in the corner, shelves along the wall, a new light fixture to brighten the space. Maybe even a rug in the center, something colorful, grounding. I nodded slowly. "We could fix it up, together if you want." Her eyes searched mine, and after a moment, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'd like that." We spent the next hour just sorting through the boxes, old photo frames, a broken lamp, some books with curled pages and faded covers. At one point, she found an old notebook and froze, fingers resting on the spine like she wasn't sure whether to open it or not. I didn't ask. I just watched her place it aside carefully. Not ready yet, but also not hiding it away again. Progress didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was in the choice to leave something visible, to let it sit in the light. When we were done for the day, the room still looked rough around the edges, but lighter somehow, like it had exhaled. She stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her jeans, and said, "It's strange. I used to avoid this room. Now I keep thinking about what it could become." I leaned against the doorframe beside her, close but not touching. Maybe that's the best kind of change, I said. It's the kind you don't force, but eventually grow into. The sun had dipped low again, casting long shadows across the floor. I thought about leaving, about giving her space, but Elise surprised me by asking if I'd stay for dinner again. It's nothing fancy, she said quickly, almost defensively. Just soup. I was going to make it anyway. I smiled. Soup. Sounds perfect. So we made it together. Chopping carrots, peeling potatoes, stirring slowly over the stove while the windows fogged up slightly from the heat. She played music against something instrumental, gentle and slow and every so often. Our arms would brush or we'd reach for the same spice, jar at the same time, and share a glance that lasted a beat longer than necessary. We ate at the small kitchen table this time, across from each other, legs almost touching beneath the surface. Conversation wandered from mundane to meaningful with no clear path. Books she never finished. Jobs I once took just to escape my own silence. Movies we both watched as kids that still made us cry. There was no rush to fill the air, no need to impress. Just the slow unfolding of two lives that had somehow found a rhythm in the quiet. After dinner, she asked if I wanted to stay a little longer. We moved to the living room, the same place where she'd first handed me that chipped mug of coffee weeks ago. She curled her legs beneath her on the couch, and I sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her arm against mine. The lights were dimmed, the music still playing softly in the background, and for a long while, we said nothing. Just sat there, side by side, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then, almost shyly, she rested her head on my shoulder. No words, no explanation. It's just that small, quiet act of leaning. And I let her settle into the space between us. Let the moment stretch without breaking it. My hand found hers after a while, and she didn't pull away. She didn't flinch or freeze or fill the space with words. She just let our fingers rest together, gently, as if they'd been waiting to fit that way all along. The clock ticked softly. On the wall. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once before the world fell silent again. And in that silence, something shifted. Not just in her, but in me. We weren't strangers anymore. We weren't even new acquaintances. We were something else now. Something forming gently in the dark, in the warmth, in the shared breath of two people finally finding peace where there had once only been distance. And I knew, with a quiet certainty I couldn't explain, that this was just the beginning. The next time I returned to Elise's house, it wasn't for work or dinner or even conversation. It was because I wanted to be there, and because somewhere along the way, her quiet home had started to feel like a place I belonged. I pulled up to her driveway just as the sun was beginning its descent, casting that golden hue across the neighborhood. That always made everything seem softer, more forgiving. I didn't even knock. I waited a moment, breathing in the cool air, then stepped up and gently tapped the door once before it opened. She stood there already waiting, hair pulled back, loosely, a faint smudge of flour on her temple. She smiled the moment she saw me, not wide or excited, but steady, grounded. The kind of smile that welcomed you into a feeling more than a place. Inside, the house smelled like bread freshly baked, warm, comforting. There was a loaf cooling. On the counter, beside a small jar of butter and a knife that had clearly just been used. The painting room was open again, too, light spilling out into the hall. I noticed she'd hung something new, a small canvas with muted earth tones and soft brushwork, abstract but warm. It wasn't there before. She caught me looking and said she wasn't sure what it was supposed to be, only that she painted it during a thunderstorm 2 nights ago. I couldn't sleep, she added, then didn't explain further. She didn't need to. We moved to the kitchen without saying much. And for the next few minutes, all that filled the space was the sound of crust cracking beneath the knife, the quiet scrape of butter spreading, and the shared silence of people who didn't feel pressured to speak, just to make the air feel full. She handed me a piece without ceremony, and I took it with both hands like it was something sacred. Maybe it was. The bread was warm, soft on the inside, slightly crisped around the edges. I hadn't eaten anything that good in a long time, and maybe that had less to do with the recipe and more with who made it and where I was when I tasted it. We sat by the window afterward. The sky outside was softening into lavender, and the first stars were beginning to flicker through the gaps in the branches. Elise leaned forward, elbows on the table, and stared out like she was watching something distant and invisible. After a while, she spoke. When I first bought this place, I thought I'd only stay for a year. It was too quiet, too still. I thought it would swallow me. I watched her face as she said it, not sad, not angry, just honest. And now, I asked quietly. She tilted her head, considering. Now I think maybe the silence isn't the problem. Maybe I just didn't know how to listen to it before. We spent the rest of the evening walking through her backyard. The garden was mostly overgrown, but there were still hints of what. It might have been once lavender bushes near the edge of the fence, a few stubborn herbs growing wild by the steps. She showed me a rusted watering can she kept near the shed and said she used to come out early in the mornings, before everything got too hot, just to feel like she had a rhythm. Even if the rhythm was just watering dirt, she added, half smiling. I told her I thought that sounded like hope. She didn't answer, but she reached for my hand again, and we stood there for a moment, fingers laced, surrounded by tall grass and fading light. Later, we sat on the old porch swing. It creaked gently beneath our weight, moving with the wind. I asked her if she ever thought about leaving, about starting over somewhere new. She shrugged slowly. Sometimes, she admitted, but every time I imagine it, it feels like erasing. Something I haven't finished yet. I nodded. I knew that feeling too well. Maybe starting over isn't about moving, I said. Maybe it's just about letting yourself see the same place differently. She turned toward me, eyes soft and thoughtful, then leaned her head gently against my shoulder. I wrapped an arm around her without thinking, and she sighed, not tired, not weary, just content. We didn't talk much after that. The stars came out in full, and the sounds of the neighborhood faded into the background. There was a kind of intimacy in the quiet, the kind that didn't need to be broken with questions or declarations, just presence, just being. Just two. People letting the world pause for a little while. At one point, I glanced down at her and found her watching me. She didn't look away. I used to think safety was something you had to build alone, she said softly. Walls, locks, alarms. All these things to keep the world out. But now I think maybe. Maybe it's about who lets the world in with you. I didn't respond. With words, I just held her a little closer. Eventually, it got late. She stood first, stretching, then looked at me like she wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next. I stepped inside to grab my jacket, and when I turned back, she was standing in the hallway, framed by the soft light of the kitchen. Do you want to stay for a while? She asked. Her voice was casual, but the moment wasn't. It wasn't an invitation into romance, or something rushed or expected. It was a quiet welcome, a gentle nudge forward into trust. I nodded, setting my jacket down. We ended up watching an old black and white movie on the couch, her head against my chest, my fingers idly tracing circles against her arm. At some point she fell asleep like that, and I didn't move. I didn't want to. The rhythm of her breath, the warmth of her body against mine, the faint sounds of laughter from the television, it all felt like something whole, something real. I'd spent so much of my life moving from place to place, job to job, never quite settling, never letting anything root. But in that moment, in that quiet room with her leaning into me, I felt grounded. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if this would become a love story in the traditional sense, or if it would unfold into something softer, slower, more complex. But I knew that I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to run. For the first time in years, I wasn't. Searching for the next thing, I was here. With her, and that for now was everything. When I woke up the next morning, Elise was still curled up next to me, her breathing slow and even, the kind of deep sleep that suggested she hadn't rested. That peacefully, in a long time, I didn't move. I just watched her for a few moments. The sunlight filtering in through the blinds and catching the wisps of hair across her forehead. It felt like being suspended in something quiet and sacred, a moment untouched by noise or doubt. My body was stiff from the awkward angle I'd fallen asleep in, but I didn't care. There was a kind of stillness wrapped around us. I wasn't about to be the one to break it. Eventually, she stirred. It's just enough to shift slightly and rest her head against my chest. She didn't open her eyes, didn't say anything, but her fingers moved slowly across my forearm in absent-minded circles, and I took that as a sign to stay exactly where I was. We lay like that for a long time. It's no plans, no clock watching, just the comfort of each other's presence. It felt strange and yet entirely natural. It's like something we hadn't talked about, but had both silently agreed on, that this connection, whatever it was allowed to grow without explanation. Later, over a quiet breakfast, Elise admitted she hadn't had someone stay over since before her divorce. She said it not with shame, but with a kind of quiet observation, like she was acknowledging a fact she hadn't revisited in a while. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to know every detail of what went wrong before. I was more interested in what was starting to feel right now. After I left that day, I found myself thinking about her house, not just as a job site or a retreat, but as a shared space. A place where something new was blooming between us, slowly and patiently. I stopped by a hardware store that afternoon and bought a few things, paint samples, light fixtures, new handles for the old dresser we'd uncovered in the spare room. Nothing fancy, just the kind of small changes that made a space feel like it was transforming with you. I didn't tell her I was doing it. I just kept the supplies in my van, waiting for the right moment. That moment came the following weekend. When Elise texted and asked if I could help her move a few things in the back room, she didn't say it directly, but I could tell she wanted to keep making progress. They're not just with the space, but with herself. When I arrived, she was already in the room. Hair tied up, sleeves rolled, a faint trace of dust on her cheek. No. She greeted me with a smile that was less guarded than before, one that reached her eyes fully. We spent the day moving boxes, rearranging furniture, and wiping down surfaces. The room started to open up as we worked, sunlight spilling in through the windows we'd finally cleared. I showed her the paint swatches I'd brought, and she picked one without hesitation, a warm clay tone that brought out the depth of the wooden floorboards. She asked if we could paint together the following weekend, and I said yes before she even finished the sentence. Around midday, we took a break and sat on the floor, backs against the freshly dusted wall, sipping lemonade she'd made. Elise pulled her knees to her chest and stared at the ceiling thoughtfully. "I used to think this house was a mistake," she said. "Too quiet, too isolated, too much space for all the memories I didn't want to sit with. But now," she glanced at me, "now it feels like maybe I was just waiting for it to be filled differently." I nodded slowly. Sometimes places just need the right energy, the right company. She looked down at her drink, then back up. Or maybe I just needed to stop being afraid of what I'd find in the silence. The thing about Elise was that she never dramatized anything. Her emotions didn't come out in floods. They came in carefully chosen words, small actions, the gentle unpeeling of layers she hadn't touched in years. Being with her wasn't about fireworks. It was about warmth, quiet understanding, the slow, steady presence of someone who didn't expect you to be anything but honest. Over the next week, we spent more time together. I came over to help with little repairs, but we always ended up sitting on the porch afterward or eating together in the kitchen. Sometimes we'd listen to music, sometimes we'd talk, and other times we'd just sit in silence, letting the stillness wrap around us like a blanket. I learned her little habits, how she always tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, how she liked to fold dish towels in perfect thirds, how she hummed without realizing when she was painting. She, in turn, learned mine, how I tapped my fingers when I was deep in thought, how I always added a touch too much pepper to my food, how I liked to take long drives without a destination, just to clear my head. One night, I brought over a set of solar-powered string lights and asked if she'd mind if I installed them along her backyard fence. She watched as I climbed the ladder and carefully fastened each bulb, her arms crossed and a small amused smile playing on her lips. When I finished and flipped the switch, the lights cast a soft golden glow across the yard. The grass barefoot and looked up, arms wrapped around herself. "It looks like fireflies," she said quietly. I joined her, hands in my pockets. "Thought you might like it. Makes the yard feel a little more alive." She nodded slowly. "It does." We stood there for a while, and then she turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked. You've gone above and beyond. You don't even know what this is yet, what we are." I took a moment to think, then met her gaze. "I don't need a label to know that being here feels right. That helping you, being around you, it matters. Whatever this is, it's worth showing up for." She didn't respond at first, but then she stepped closer, reached up, and gently touched my cheek with her fingers. "You're not what I expected," she said, "but you're exactly what I needed." We didn't kiss. There was no dramatic crescendo. Just a quiet acceptance, a shared understanding that something meaningful was unfolding between us. Piece by piece. That night, as I drove home, under a sky scattered with stars, I thought about how some of the most important things in life don't announce themselves. They whisper. They arrive quietly, like light filtering through a cracked door, like a hand reaching for yours in the dark. Like a voice that says, without fanfare, "I feel safe with you here." And suddenly, I wasn't just thinking about Elise. I was thinking about us. The following days moved gently, like late summer breezes brushing through half-open windows. I was still working, taking calls, moving between job sites. But somehow Elise's house had become the silent center of my week. A place I gravitated toward when the noise got too loud or when the days felt too repetitive. She never asked when I'd come by next. There were no plans made in advance, no expectations outlined. But there was always a quiet assumption now that I'd show up, and that she'd be glad I did. That unspoken trust felt more real than anything I'd known in years that weekend. We finally painted the room in the back of her house, the one she once avoided, the one we now stood in together, barefoot. With the windows open and the scent of possibility hanging in the air, Elise had chosen the clay-colored tone from the samples I'd brought. As we rolled the paint onto the walls, I watched how the light shifted around us. Her movements were focused but relaxed, and every now and then she'd flick paint in my direction on purpose, laughing in that low, earthy tone I'd come to look forward to more than any music or radio show. There was something therapeutic about painting beside her. With every brushstroke, the space changed, becoming less of a room and more of a statement, a quiet reclaiming of something she'd once ignored. We worked in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging glances, sharing a bottle of iced tea, listening to the sound of the roller against the wall and the birds calling faintly through the trees. It felt like building something together, even if what we were building couldn't be named yet. At one point, while I was focused on the edge near the baseboard, Elise sat down in the middle of the floor and just stared at the walls. I joined her without asking, both of us sitting cross-legged, our hands speckled with dried paint. She sighed, not heavily, just enough to suggest a thought was about to surface. "You know," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I first bought this house, it was right after everything fell apart. My marriage, my job, my confidence. All of it collapsed around the same time. This room especially, it always felt like the embodiment of everything I didn't want to face. So I just shut the door and told myself I didn't need it." Looked down at her hands. "Oh, but lately I've been thinking maybe healing starts with opening doors again." I didn't try to fix the silence that followed. I didn't rush in with platitudes or tell her she was brave or strong, even though she was. Instead, I reached over and brushed a streak of paint from her cheek. She smiled faintly. That was enough. After the paint dried and the light shifted. Too early evening, Elise pulled out a small rug from the closet and unrolled it in the center of the room. It was patterned in soft reds and golds, slightly frayed at the edges. She smoothed it out with her palms as if laying a foundation for something new. Then she brought in a chair, a small lamp, and one of her unfinished canvases. "This isn't a studio," she said thoughtfully. "It's not a reading room either. I think it's just a space for me to exist in. No purpose, no pressure. Just somewhere I can be without needing to explain why. I helped her adjust the lamp, and when the warm light clicked on, the entire room seemed to exhale. We stood there for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, and I thought about how powerful it was. To make space, not just physical space, but emotional room for ourselves. For each other, that night we ate dinner on the floor of her living room, no table, no chairs. Just two people with takeout containers and glasses of wine, music playing softly in the background. The dust overlay of the day still clinging to our clothes. Elise leaned back against the couch and looked at me, her gaze steady. "I don't want to rush whatever this is," she said, "but I want you to know that I notice the way you show up. And it's been a long time since someone did that without expecting something in return." I set my food down and took her hand, not to make a statement, but to anchor the moment. Her fingers closed around mine without hesitation. "I'm not here to fix you," I said, "or change anything. I'm just here. And I want to keep being here if you'll let me." She didn't respond with words. She leaned forward, slowly, and rested her forehead against mine. And in that quiet connection, something shifted again. Not louder, not bigger, just deeper. In the days that followed, I noticed more of her world unfolding. Books began stacking in corners. Paintings found their way onto the walls. She started lighting candles in the evenings, their soft glow bouncing against the windows. Her laughter became more frequent, less restrained. The lines around her eyes softened. Even her dog, a rescue mutt named Oliver, I hadn't met until now, seemed to warm up to me. Curling at my feet while Elise and I talked long after the sun had set, there was no declaration between us, no defining moment that screamed, "We're together." But it didn't matter. What we had wasn't rushed. It was growing like roots, slow, steady, and unseen by the casual observer, but unshakable beneath the surface. One evening, as we stood at the sink together washing dishes, Elise paused and turned to me. "You remember the first night you came over?" she asked. "When I whispered that I felt safe with you?" I said, "I remember." She looked out the window, her eyes reflecting the porch lights outside. "I meant it then. But I didn't realize until now that feeling safe isn't just about someone not hurting you. It's about someone letting you breathe, letting you exist. It's letting you be messy and still show up the next day like it's the most natural thing in the world." I dried my hands on the towel and reached for hers. "You let me be the same," I said. "I didn't even know I needed that." That night, before I left, she walked me to the door and stood in the frame a little longer than usual. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to, because this wasn't an ending. It was the continuation of something steady, something real, and we both knew it. The rhythm we had quietly established began to feel like second nature. Days passed with the kind of ease that didn't demand attention, but rather invited its slow mornings, peaceful evenings, unspoken understandings that built themselves into the spaces between words. Elise and I weren't rushing toward anything, but we were certainly moving like a tide that wasn't loud but still powerful. I found myself waking up thinking about her, going to sleep wondering what part of her story she'd share next. And yet, even in the comfort of it all, life, as it always does, found a way to interrupt. It started with a missed text. I'd told Elise I'd stop by after finishing a job across town, but a last-minute call from another client pushed everything back. I was still getting used to juggling work with wanting to be present for someone else, and that evening, caught in traffic, I completely forgot to let her know. When I arrived at her doorstep, hours late and far past when we usually saw each other, her porch light was off. I knocked gently. No answer. I knocked again, waited, then finally stepped back, realizing she might have gone to bed thinking I'd changed my mind. The next morning, she didn't respond to my message right away. When she finally did, it was short. "All good. Just figured you got busy." There was no punctuation, no warmth. And while she didn't say anything more, something in my gut told me this wasn't about a delayed visit. It was about the echo of an old wound. Later that day, I stopped by, unannounced but hopeful. Elise opened the door, still in her robe. Hair damp, eyes a little tired. She didn't smile. Instead, she stepped aside to let me in, then walked straight to the kitchen and started making tea. I followed slowly, unsure how to navigate the sudden shift in temperature between us. She set 2 mugs on the counter, then turned to face me. "I know it sounds silly," she began, but I waited. Not because I expected anything. I just hoped. I nodded, hands in my pockets, feeling like a teenager who had broken curfew without realizing the rules. I should have called or texted. That's on me. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It's not about the text. Not really. It's just... I've been left before, Roman. Not in loud ways, in quiet ones. In the kind where someone starts showing up a little less, answering a little slower. And I promised myself I wouldn't sit through that again." There was no anger in her voice, just that calm, heavy kind of honesty she always carried. I took a breath, stepped closer. "Elise, I'm not going anywhere. I messed up. I got caught up, and I didn't check in. But please don't mistake that for me, pulling away. I've never wanted to stay more than I do now." She looked down at her tea, then back up at me. "That's the thing about safety, isn't it? It's not built in grand gestures. It's built in showing up, even when it's inconvenient." I nodded. "I'm learning. I want to keep learning with you." There was a pause between us, the kind that wasn't awkward but necessary. Then she reached for my hand and held it across the counter. "Okay," she said. "Just one word." But it was a door opening again. After that morning, things didn't go back to how they were. They became better, more intentional. I made it a point to check in, to communicate, not because she demanded it, but because I realized how deeply presence mattered. Elise didn't need a knight in shining armor. She needed someone consistent. Someone who knew that safety wasn't just in the calm moments, but in how we navigated the cracks. As autumn settled in, our routines deepened. Took walks more often, wrapped in scarves and coffee steam. Elise started painting more again, filling her new space with strokes that grew bolder with each canvas. I began staying over on weekends, not just to sleep beside her, but to be part of the small rituals, making breakfast, reading beside her while she painted, fixing a loose gutter together like we were building not just a house, but a home. One crisp Sunday afternoon, we drove out to the countryside, to a little apple orchard she remembered from years ago. She hadn't been back since her marriage ended, and almost didn't want to go now, but I convinced her it might be worth facing again, this time with new eyes. The drive was quiet but peaceful, the kind of silence that didn't beg to be broken. At the orchard, Elise walked slowly at first, hesitating when we passed the old wooden fence where she said she once took pictures with her ex. "I remember thinking it would last forever," she said softly. We were smiling in that photo, but I was already starting to disappear. I looked at her, wishing I could take the sting of that memory and fold it into something lighter. But instead of trying to fix it, I just stood beside her, brushing my hand lightly against hers. She didn't flinch. She took it, laced our fingers, and kept walking. By the time the sun dipped low behind the trees, we were sitting on a picnic bench, sharing cider and a cinnamon donut between us. Elise leaned her head on my shoulder and closed her eyes. "Not scared of the past," she said. "But I do wonder if I'm brave enough to write a future that doesn't look like it." I turned to kiss the top of her head. "You don't have to write it alone." She didn't say anything back, but she didn't have to. Her grip tightened around my hand. That was her answer. Back at her house that evening, we lit a fire for the first time. The living room glowed in soft flickers of orange and gold, and we curled under the same blanket, not talking much, just listening to the quiet crackle and the occasional sigh of wind outside. Oliver, her dog, rested his head on my knee, and Elise's foot brushed against mine under the blanket. This was what I'd come to cherish most, not the dramatic highs or passionate declarations, but the simple truth of being seen and seeing her fully, of sharing a space not because we had to, but because it felt like we should. The tension from earlier that week had passed, not forgotten, but integrated. And I realized then that relationships weren't made in the good days alone. They were built in the moments we stumbled and still chose to stay. October faded into November with a certain quiet grace. and the chill in the air became something we welcomed with layered clothes and warm drinks shared between cupped hands. Elise began to spend more time in her studio room, which now had a name, the solace room as she called it. I started helping her build shelves in there, installing better lighting, even crafting a custom easel that could hold her largest canvases. Watching her work became one of my favorite things. Her strokes, once hesitant, now moved with purpose and confidence. It was like I was witnessing her reclaim something piece by piece, color by color. I wasn't in the room all the time, but I didn't need to be. She invited me in when she wanted to share, and that alone was more than enough. One evening, as we sat by the fire, her head resting on my chest and her legs curled beneath her,
Elise
asked if I would help her go through the storage boxes in her attic. She hadn't been up there in years, she said, and wasn't sure what exactly remained. I offered to take care of it myself, but she shook her head. I think it's something I need to face, she said, but I don't want to do it alone. So we set a time for the following weekend. When Saturday came, we pulled down the old ladder that led to the attic and stepped into the dust-swirled air of forgotten years. The space smelled like old paper and cedar, faint traces of time resting. In the floorboards and boxes, Elise stood still for a moment, her flashlight scanning the room, before she exhaled slowly and stepped forward. We started opening boxes one by one: books, holiday decorations, her old art supplies from college, photos in frames that were either cracked or turned face down. Then she opened a small white box with her initials drawn in faded ink across the top. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, some folded, some still sealed. Her hand hovered over them like she was touching a ghost. I didn't speak. I just waited. She sat down on the wooden floor, legs crossed, and picked up the top envelope. It had no return address. I wrote these, she said to myself. During the last year of my marriage, I never sent them. I never even opened most of them again. She opened one and began to read aloud, her voice steady but quiet. The letter wasn't angry. It was filled with confusion and sadness, questions she had asked into the void. Things like, why don't I feel at home in my own house? Is love supposed to make you shrink or grow? She read through 3 before folding them back up and setting them aside. I stayed longer than I should have, she said after a long pause. Because I was afraid that leaving meant failure, afraid that starting over would hurt more than staying. I sat beside her, my shoulder against hers. But you did start over, I said. You're here now. You made a place that's yours. She nodded. Yeah, but sometimes I forget that healing doesn't mean erasing. It just means learning how to live with the memory without letting it define the next chapter. We went through the rest of the boxes together, occasionally pausing so she could tell me the story behind a photo or laugh at a long-forgotten souvenir. We stayed up there for over 2 hours, and by the time we descended the ladder, it felt like she'd left something heavy behind. Not discarded, just reorganized. Processed. And in the days that followed, I noticed the shift in her. She moved more freely through the house, her posture looser, her voice lighter. Like her past wasn't pressing down on her anymore, but simply walking a few paces behind. Meanwhile, my own life began to feel different too. My other clients noticed. I wasn't as restless as I used to be. I no longer took every job just for the money, or filled every hour of the day to avoid thinking about things. For the first time in years, I wasn't running from something. I was moving toward something. One afternoon, I got a call from my younger sister. She lived a few hours away and had 2 kids I hadn't seen in months. Her husband had just gotten a new job overseas, and she was considering moving. But I need help packing up, she said. And maybe a little more than that. I kind of need you around for a while, just until we sort everything out. I told her I'd think about it. After we hung up, I sat in my truck outside Elise's house for a long while, the engine off, the air turning cool around me. It wasn't a question of whether I wanted to help. I did. My sister had always been there for me. But the thought of being away from Elise, from this rhythm we'd found, stirred something uneasy in my chest. Not fear exactly, but a sense. That time was moving and choices were being laid out. That evening, I told Elise about the call. I didn't sugarcoat it or avoid the implication. I might have to be gone for a few weeks, maybe longer. I expected her to withdraw or grow tense, but she didn't. She listened, asked questions, and then said something that caught me off guard. "You should go," she said. "If your family needs you, you should be there." I blinked. "You might be upset," she shook her head. "I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't miss you. But love whatever this is becoming isn't about keeping someone close just to soothe your own fear. It's about letting them do what they need to do and knowing they'll come back if they mean it." I swallowed hard. "I do mean it." Then, "Come back when you can," she said, "and don't rush. Want you whole, not torn." That night, we sat in the solace room with the window open, the cold air tempered by a thick blanket draped over both our shoulders. We didn't talk about timelines or plans. We just sat there, hands clasped. Listening to the wind rustle the trees and the creak of the house settling in for the night, she rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "You made this place feel like home again, so go take care of your people. And when you're ready, we'll pick up right where we left off." It wasn't a goodbye, it was an understanding. It's one forged not in need, but in trust. Leaving wasn't as simple as throwing a bag in the truck and heading down the highway. It was the process of slowly detaching from something you weren't quite ready to leave behind, even if only for a short while. In the days leading up to my departure, I made sure to finish every little project I'd started around Elise's house. I patched the gap in her back gate, fixed the slow leak under her sink, and even oiled the hinges on her front door so it wouldn't creak when she opened it in the early mornings. None of these things were urgent, but they felt important. My own quiet way of saying, I was here, and I'll be back. Elise didn't hover or cling during those final days. She remained calm, present, even supportive. But I could see the shifts in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking, the flicker of something unspoken. The tightness in her smile when she reminded me to pack warm clothes. She wasn't holding me back, but she was holding space. There was something remarkably brave about that. The night before I left, we shared dinner in her living room again, this time with candles flickering across the windowsill and soft music drifting through the house. We ate slowly like we were memorizing the meal, and afterward, we sat in silence for a long time. Elise leaned into me, her head resting just beneath my chin, and I felt the weight of her breathing steady, deliberate. Neither of us said what. We were both thinking that things might feel different after I was gone, no matter how short the time. But when I stood at her door the next morning, bag slung over my shoulder, Elise pulled me into the longest hug we'd ever shared. She didn't cry, she didn't whisper promises. She simply held me like she was tucking a part of me into her heart, saving it until I returned. And I held her just as tightly, trying to carry the warmth of her presence with me. The drive to my sister's felt longer than it should have. Mostly because my thoughts kept drifting back to Elise. Every mile that stretched between us carried the echo of her voice, the scent of her studio, the quiet strength in the way she always knew when to speak and when to let silence be enough. But once I arrived and saw the chaos of boxes, toddlers, a frazzled sibling trying to hold it all together, I shifted gears. The days that followed were packed lifting, taping, organizing, and calming crying kids who missed their dad. Fell into a rhythm, waking up early to help my sister prep meals, running errands, making calls about their move overseas. At night, when the house finally quieted, I'd sit on the small patio out back and scroll through old photos on my phone, pictures of Elise's backyard in golden hour light. Snapshots of her half-finished paintings, even blurry ones she took of me, with her phone when I wasn't paying attention. She didn't send me texts every day, but when she did, they were simple and grounding. "Studio smells like linseed oil today. Makes me think of you. Oliver misses you. So do I, but don't rush. I found an old record in the thrift store. Made me smile. Hope you're okay." Each message landed like a stone in calm water, rippling through me with a quiet, undeniable impact. I responded in kind, not with long paragraphs, but with thoughts that came from wherever I was in the moment. "Fixed a broken window latch today and thought of your attic. Kids spilled applesauce on me. I miss grown-up conversations. Can't wait to see that painting finished. Even half done, it's beautiful. 2 weeks passed, and I began to sense that my sister was finally regaining her footing. Her kids had adjusted, routines had returned, and the towering stacks of boxes had dwindled into manageable corners. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, she sat across from me on the porch and gave me a long, searching look. "You're different," she said. "Softer, I think." "Calmer," I raised an eyebrow. "Softer," she smiled. "Not in a bad way, just more centered, like you're not running anymore." I nodded slowly, knowing she was right. "I met someone." Her smile widened. I figured. "The way you keep checking your phone like it breathes?" I laughed. "She's not like anyone I've ever known. It's not fireworks and chaos. It's just safe, steady." My sister reached out and squeezed my hand. "Then go back to that. When you're ready, don't let time dilute something good." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had shifted in me over the past month. It wasn't just Elise. It was what she reflected back at me, my own desire to stop running, to root into something real. She hadn't saved me, and I hadn't saved her. We'd simply met at a time when we were both quietly rebuilding, and somehow became part of each other's process. I drove back 2 days later, the road familiar, the sky overcast with a hint of winter threatening on the horizon. Didn't tell Elise I was coming. Part of me wanted to surprise her. Part of me wanted to see what it felt like to knock on her door again and hope like I had all those weeks ago that she would open it. As I pulled into her driveway, I saw a faint curl of smoke rising from the chimney. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow over the steps. I walked up slowly, heart pounding in a way it hadn't since our first few days. And when I knocked, the door opened before my hand even dropped to my side. She stood there in her slippers, her hair tucked. Behind one ear, her eyes wide but calm. She didn't say anything at first. Neither did I. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that reaches all the way to your chest, and stepped forward into my arms. I held her like I'd been holding my breath for weeks. She smelled like lavender and paint, and her cheek was warm against mine. "I was just about to make tea," she said softly. "You're right on time." We stepped inside, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I realized something home wasn't a place. It was a person, a connection, shared silence. And as the door closed behind us, I knew this wasn't the end of a visit. It was the continuation of something neither of us wanted to pause again, the first morning after. I returned felt surreal, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because of how natural everything felt. Elise had already been awake before I stirred, her quiet footsteps moving through the house with the familiarity of someone at peace in her space. The scent of coffee drifted in from the kitchen, blending with the faint wood smoke from the fireplace, and when I stepped into the room, she greeted me with a soft smile and a second mug already waiting for me. It wasn't a grand reunion with fanfare or declarations. It was something quieter, more grounded. It was two people slipping comfortably back into a rhythm that had always made sense. We sat on the couch, sharing a blanket over our laps as we sipped our drinks. The silence between us wasn't tense or expectant. It was full. Full of things we didn't need to say because they lived in the glance across the rim of a mug, in the way her toes found mine beneath the blanket, in the warmth that lingered even after the coffee had cooled. Elise didn't ask for stories about my trip, not right away, and I didn't press her for updates on the house or her art. Instead, gave each other space to readjust, to settle back into the stillness we had built together before life briefly called me away. Over the following days, I helped her in the garden again, now preparing it for winter. The last of the autumn leaves were raked into neat piles, and we mulched the flower beds together, both of us in thick sweaters and gloves, laughing over how clumsy I looked trying to manage her antique wheelbarrow. Elise was more animated than before I left, more playful. She teased me about my city hands and about the soft streak of gray in my beard that seemed to have grown more noticeable during my absence. I fired back with mock indignation, pointing out that she was hoarding all the good mugs again. It was silly, easy banter, but behind it lived something richer, a comfort, that came from knowing we had weathered space and time and still wanted to share the same soil inside. The changes were even more subtle, but just as meaningful. Elise had started hanging her new paintings throughout the house. They weren't finished pieces yet, but works in progress she was proud enough to display. One large canvas hung in the hallway, now an abstract piece, with deep swirls of indigo and gold that somehow made the small space feel expansive. When I asked her about it, she simply said, "It's how it feels when someone sees you and doesn't look away." Her words stayed with me. At night, we cooked together more often than not. We had developed this unspoken system. She chopped, I stirred, she seasoned, I set the table. We played music from an old Bluetooth speaker she kept on. High shelf in the kitchen, and sometimes we danced while waiting for water to boil. There was a moment, one chilly evening, when she leaned against me as I stirred a pot of soup, her cheek pressed against my back, arms around my waist, and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How a person can come back and make it feel like they never left." I turned, wrapped her in my arms, and kissed her forehead. We didn't talk about timelines or labels. We didn't need to. Still, life didn't pause just because we found a pocket of joy. One afternoon, while Elise was in her studio and I was out picking up a few supplies, I ran into a former coworker at the hardware store. Mike had been one of the few people I stayed in touch with after walking away from my old contracting crew. He greeted me with his usual boisterous enthusiasm and asked what I'd been up to. I gave him a vague answer about doing smaller projects and staying local, and he nodded knowingly. "Well," said, clapping a hand on my shoulder, "if you ever want to come back, we've got a big job coming up. Commercial contract out in the city, long hours but good money, starts next month. I'll send you the details." I smiled and thanked him, but the moment I walked away, a knot tightened in my stomach. That kind of offer would have thrilled me a year ago. Now it felt like a question I wasn't sure how to answer. Did I want to go back to that pace, those pressures, that life? Could I even imagine waking up at 5 a.m. to haul equipment across a steel site and not feel like I was walking backward? That night, I told Elise about the encounter. We were curled up on the couch again, another fire crackling nearby her head, resting against my chest. She didn't react with worry or jealousy. She didn't ask what I was going to do. Instead, she said it's okay not to want what you used to want. And that was it. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror, shaving, staring at my reflection like it might give me the answer. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to prove something to myself, to my father, to people who didn't even remember my name anymore. I'd worked through injuries, pushed through burnout, said yes to every job that paid just enough to justify the ache in my back. And now, for the first time, I realized I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I was choosing peace. That week, Elise asked if I would help her install a new lighting system in the hallway. She said she wanted softer light, something warm that felt like candlelight without the risk of burning the house down. As we worked side by side, drilling into the ceiling and adjusting fixtures, she told me about a grant she was considering applying for. It's a chance to showcase her work in a regional gallery. Her eyes sparkled when she talked about it. She also admitted she was nervous. "I haven't shown anything outside of town in years," she said. "It's not just the art, it's me. It's putting myself out there again." I set down the drill, took her hand and looked her straight in the eye. "Your work deserves to be seen. So do you." She smiled, and something in her expression shifted. Not just gratitude, but belief. That night, we turned on the new hallway lights and stood in the middle of the space, bathed in soft gold. It felt like a scene from a memory we hadn't lived. Yet something warm, safe, and just a little magical. She took my hand, led me to the center of the hallway, and kissed me without a word. It was slow, sure, and filled with everything we'd learned in the spaces between the moments. And in that kiss, I knew we were no longer just sharing time. We were building a life. The days that followed settled into something that looked a lot like a quiet kind of happiness. The kind that didn't need grand declarations or calendar markings to feel meaningful. Elise and I spent most of our time working on little projects together, adding shelves to her studio, rearranging the guest room for a visiting friend she kept saying might never come, or repainting the porch swing simply because the color didn't feel right anymore. It was domestic and ordinary in the best way. We weren't rushing toward anything. We were just living. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like enough. But as much as I wanted to believe we could live in that bubble indefinitely, life had a way of testing what you thought you knew about stability. It started with a knock at the door late one morning while Elise was out visiting a local art supply store. I answered, expecting maybe a delivery or a neighbor, but instead found myself face to face with someone I hadn't seen in almost 2 years. Miriam, my ex-she, stood on the porch wearing sunglasses and a long coat. Her hair shorter than I remembered, and her posture as rigid as ever. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she took off her sunglasses and looked me dead in the eye. "I'm not here to start anything," she said. "I just need 5 minutes." I stepped aside and let her in, more out of surprise than willingness. She walked slowly, taking in the house with that critical eye I remembered all too well. When we reached the living room, she turned to me and crossed her arms. "You disappeared, Roman," she said. "No forwarding address, no number, not even a goodbye." I exhaled, steadying myself. "We said all the goodbyes that needed to be said, Miriam. I just stopped pretending I had to keep picking up your pieces." Her expression softened slightly. "I know I wasn't good to you. I made things worse when they didn't need to be. That doesn't mean I didn't care." "You cared when it was convenient," I said, not bitterly, but with the calm that comes from having told yourself the truth so many times, it no longer stings. "What do you want?" She looked down, then pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket and handed it to me. It was from her lawyer, apparently. An old property we had once considered co-investing in had gone into probate due to some financial technicalities, something I'd completely forgotten. My name was still attached. Now it needed my signature to be officially cleared. "I thought I'd mail it," she said, but then I figured. Closure. I glanced at the paper, then back at her. Came all this way for closure?
Is she?
Hesitated. "No. I came because I heard you were happy. And I guess I wanted to see what that looked like." The conversation didn't last much longer. Signed the form, handed it back, and walked her to the door. As she stepped onto the porch, she turned one last time. "She's the one, isn't she?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, she is." Miriam didn't smile, but she didn't scoff either. She just gave a small nod and left. When Elise returned an hour later, she found me standing in the backyard, staring out over the leaf-strewn grass. She walked up behind me and touched my arm, her gaze full of quiet curiosity. "I saw a car in the driveway," she said. "Everything okay?" I told her the truth. Every detail. She listened without interrupting, without letting her expression harden or fall. When I finished, she only said one thing. "Did you tell her about us?" "Not in words," I said, but she knew. Elise looked away for a moment, chewing the inside of her cheek, the way she did when she was trying not to overthink. Then she nodded. "Good." We didn't dwell on it, but something had shifted. That night, as we lay in bed, Elise rolled over and studied my face. In the half-light of the room, I could see the shadows flicker across her eyes. "I'm not afraid of your past," she said softly, "but I need to know that you're not still carrying it." I took her hand in mine, kissed her knuckles. "Not, but sometimes it shows up to see if I'll pick it back up." She smiled faintly, her thumb brushing across my wrist. "Well, you didn't. That means something." In the days that followed, we both became a little more reflective, not out of worry, but out of recognition. Relationships, even the good ones, require a constant choosing. You don't just fall into something and expect it to hold. Go build it brick by brick, word by word, decision by decision. And that week, it was like we were both checking the foundation to make sure it was solid. Elise invited me into her process more than ever before. She started bringing her easel out into the living room while I worked on fixing the old window frames. We would sit in the same space, not always speaking, but sharing something deeper than conversation. One night, she painted while I read a dog-eared copy of Steinbeck, and when I glanced up, I realized she was painting me not directly, but some version of me. A silhouette hunched over a book, surrounded by soft amber tones and brushstrokes that looked like quiet. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and said, "I like painting things I want to remember." That evening, over dinner, she asked a question that hung heavy between us. "What does commitment look like to you now?" It was a fair question. Neither of us had thrown that word around much. We'd been too focused on healing, on being present, on not forcing something fragile to fit into a rigid box. But now, the idea of the future had become a part of our everyday conversations. "I think it looks like waking up and choosing the same person every day," I said slowly. "Even when it's not easy. Even when life pulls you in different directions, it's showing up." She nodded. "To me, it's being brave enough to keep growing while letting someone witness all of it." There wasn't a proposal that night. No ring, no promises carved into stone. But there was an agreement, a mutual understanding that we weren't just passing time anymore. We were building something that would need tending, something that would stretch and bend, and sometimes even ache, but would be worth every moment. As we cleared the dishes and stood in the kitchen, as the warm overhead, light casting soft halos on the wooden counter, Elise reached over and took my hand. "So, do we keep building?" she asked. I squeezed her hand, leaned in, kissed her like the answer had always been yes. The next few weeks moved with a kind of grounded momentum. Elise and I weren't in a rush to change anything about what we had, but we could both feel a new current running beneath the surface, something steady and forward-moving, something deliberate. We had crossed an invisible threshold, not with a ceremony or a title, but with quiet affirmations, gestures that whispered a future. She started referring to small corners of the house as ours instead of mine. I caught myself measuring my own plans with her in mind, mentally shifting appointments or errands to make space for things like morning coffee together or a late afternoon walk before the sun dipped too low behind the trees. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, but it was real. Then one morning, it arrived in email in Elise's inbox. Subject line in bold: "Congratulations, you've been selected." I didn't know what it meant at first. She was still half asleep in the kitchen, hair tied up in a loose bun, glasses perched on her nose as she read it. The silence that followed wasn't one of dread, but disbelief. She read it again, then turned the screen toward me with a stunned look in her eyes. It was the gallery. The regional exhibit she had hesitated to apply for. The one she'd nearly talked herself out of because she didn't feel ready to step back into that world again. But she had submitted 3 pieces, just in case. And now they wanted all 3 and more if she had them. "They want me to showcase a series," she whispered. "A full-room installation in the city for 6 weeks." Her voice was breathless, like she didn't trust the air around her to hold the weight of what she'd just said. I crossed the room and wrapped her in my arms, lifting her slightly off the ground as I spun her once, just to watch her laugh. It was a real laugh, bright and stunned. It's a kind that spilled out of her like it had been waiting for a reason. But joy has arrived, holding hands with questions. The gallery was 3 hours away. The exhibit would require her to be in the city multiple days each week, especially in the weeks leading up to opening night. There would be panels to attend, collectors to meet, and long hours preparing the space. It wasn't just about the art, it was about her being visible again, professionally, socially, emotionally. And that would mean time apart. We talked about it that night, sitting on the porch with a blanket wrapped around our legs and a bottle of wine between us. Elise was excited, but she was also visibly nervous. She turned her wine glass in slow circles, watching the liquid spin like she was divining answers from it. "I haven't done anything like this since before Peter died," she said. "That whole world stopped feeling like mine a long time ago." I reached for her hand. "Maybe it's always been yours. You just needed to walk back in through a different door." She smiled softly, eyes glistening. "Now what if I lose? The balance I've found here, with you, with the quiet, the rhythm, then we adjust," I said. "Find a new rhythm. But you don't get small again, Elise. Not for anyone, especially not for me." She leaned her head on my shoulder after that. We watched the stars come out in silence. A few days later, we began preparing for the change. Elise turned the spare bedroom into a makeshift packing and planning zone.
Actions.
Paint swatches. Photographs of her older pieces, all of it laid out like a map of who she had been and who she might become. I helped where I could, building custom crates for her canvases, researching transportation logistics, and creating a spreadsheet for her schedule. I didn't know the first thing about the gallery world, but I knew how to support someone doing something bold. At the same time, I received an email of my own. Mike had followed through on that earlier conversation and sent me the full details of the commercial job out in the city. It was a huge project, months of work, steady pay, and the kind of professional bump that came with being part of a landmark. Renovation? The kicker? It was located just 15 minutes from Elise's gallery. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. I didn't tell her about it right away. I wasn't hiding it, just wasn't sure what it meant yet. Part of me worried that taking the job would blur the lines we'd drawn so carefully. I didn't want her to feel like I was following her out of obligation. I didn't want to insert myself into her space when she was finally reclaiming it. But the other part of me, the part that knew how hard it was to balance love and ambition, saw the possibility in it. What if we could both grow without pulling away? What if we could prove that together didn't have to mean sacrifice? The decision weighed on me. I spent late nights pacing the backyard, pretending to fix things that weren't broken, just so I could think. Eventually, I told her. We were having breakfast, sunlight cutting across the kitchen in golden slants, her bare feet tucked under her chair. I laid out the email, the offer, the timeline. Her response surprised me. "I think you should take it," she said almost instantly. I blinked. "You do?" She nodded. "If this were reversed, I'd want your support. You've always been the one helping me build. Let me do the same for you. But won't it be hard?" I asked. "Me being out there too? Us balancing all of that?" "Of course it'll be hard," she said, "but so is anything worth keeping. You don't get to have something real." Without learning how to stretch, that night we made a plan. We'd commute together some days. Other times we'd coordinate schedules so we could at least share dinners. We agreed not to pressure the time we had, but to honor it. And more importantly, we promised to communicate when it got difficult because we knew it would. As the weeks went by and we transitioned into this new phase, we both learned how to live in the stretch. Elise spent more time in the city than she had in years, her calendar filling up with meetings, creative reviews, and late-night brainstorming sessions with curators. I threw myself into the job site, managing a crew of 10, overseeing blueprints, and finding pride again in the physical work that had once defined me. Some nights, I'd come back to her apartment in the city and find her asleep on the couch, a sketchbook resting on her chest. Other times, she'd meet me at a cafe after my shift, both of us dirty and tired, but smiling. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't cinematic, but it was real. We learned to celebrate the small things. Friday night with no obligations, a shared morning run. Even something as simple as brushing our teeth side by side in a cramped bathroom before collapsing into bed felt like an accomplishment. And through all of it, we kept choosing each other. By the time Elise's gallery opening arrived, the rhythm we had crafted together felt like a second skin worn, uncomfortable, lived. We stood side by side at the entrance as guests filtered through. Elise's fingers curled lightly around mine, her eyes alight with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The room had been transformed into a quiet marvel of color and story. Her paintings didn't just hang, they breathed. People moved slowly from one to the next, pausing, whispering, writing in notepads. I kept stealing glances at her, watching how she received their praise with humility and grace. There was a kind of glow around her that night, and though she smiled at everyone, I knew which smiles were just politeness, and which were real. I caught the real ones every time they landed on me. But later that week, a letter came from a gallery in New York, bigger, bolder, and with a permanent residency offer. They wanted her to consider moving. Full representation, press coverage, a studio space in Manhattan. I saw the way her hand trembled slightly holding the letter, and I knew what was coming. And on the same day, I got a call from my younger brother. Our mother had fallen. It wasn't minor. There'd be surgery, rehab, and likely a move back home. 2 paths splitting. Both of us, standing at crossroads we hadn't planned for. The silence between us that evening wasn't tense, but it was weighty. Elise sat at the edge of the porch, letter in hand, reading it for what must have been the 5th time. I stood nearby, phone still warm in my pocket after hanging up with my brother. The late autumn air had turned cool, the kind of quiet that settled in when the world held its breath. We both knew we were standing at the edge of something, not apart from each other, but facing different directions. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but clear. She said she wanted to go not because she wanted to leave what we had, but because there was a part of her that had finally remembered how to dream again, and she needed to follow that. And I told her I understood, because I did. I had my own road to walk now, too. Back home to take care of a woman who had raised me with calloused hands and a quiet strength. I hadn't appreciated it until it was nearly gone. We didn't fight it. We didn't beg each other to stay. We just held hands longer that night, kissed slower, packed carefully. Elise left for New York a week later, and I left for the old farmhouse that still creaked like it remembered me. Called. We texted. Sometimes she sent me photos of her studio. I sent her pictures of Mom smiling in the sun. We didn't call it goodbye, called it love, stretched across 2 places. Months passed, and while the ache of distance never fully faded, neither did the certainty that what we had built mattered, that it had changed us. It was still growing, just differently. One day I know we'll find each other again, maybe when the season turns or when a gallery opens closer to home. Maybe when my mother no longer needs daily care and Elise has seen her name in lights. But until then, we live fully in our separate paths, hearts tethered by something deeper than geography, something honest, something safe. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.